Say Brothers is a program by, for, and about the black community.
What political influence do you feel Malcolm X had on the black struggle in this country?
I think Malcolm X reached certain dimensions that was missed by others and is still missed by others. The important thing is that Malcolm X found a kind of language that the ordinary workaday black man can understand. And he heard things from Malcolm that he had heard partly from other people, but he didn't listen to those other people because those things were not couched in a language that attracted him. I think his great political influence is that he took the politics of struggle down to the area where the struggle was most needed.
Theoretically, of course, what influence do you think Malcolm would have if he were alive today?
I think Malcolm would have a unifying influence if he was alive now. And he still might expand the struggle even further among ordinary blacks. And I think Malcolm X would be able to deal with some of the political contradictions in black life more realistically than others have done so far. And I think he would see the international dimensions of political struggle much better than I think our present-day politicians are seeing it.
What kind of contradictions exist in black life?
The contradiction of thinking that your oppressor will participate in your liberation, and that your oppressor will dismantle his big international economic apparatus in order to bring social reform to you or anyone else. When he put up the apparatus with your labor and with your blood and used your labor as the seed money to erect the structure of capitalism, the whole economic system, because he had your labor. Then there 300 years free of charge. He's erected a worldwide economic system, but to be naive enough to think that he's going to give you anything other than crumbs of appeasement from this apparatus, or he's going to dismantle any of it in your favor, is just downright wild. It is beyond a contradiction. It is a form of insanity.
How did Malcolm develop an international perspective on our struggle?
Oh, that was in his last trip to Africa and his contact with African nations who had promised him that they would take the case of the American black to the United Nations as a human rights case, as they're authorized to do under the United Nations Charter, and not as a civil rights case. He had attempted to internationalize the black struggle and to take it beyond its domestic base into the international arena. Now, he barely got this off of the ground. That and his petition to the United Nations that was in draft form when he died, a petition for black people to have representation at the United Nations as an internal nation, a colonized nation within the United States. This took a great deal of skill and nerve, and this may be the cause of his death. I have, in my study of black leadership, especially in this country, I see one pattern repeating itself. Every black leader who shows black people the true nature of power and how to deal with it is either assassinated, driven into exile, or driven to suicide. And the pattern has not varied from the mysterious disappearance of David Walker, 1829, after his famous appeal. And you can look at this pattern and you see its consistency. W.B. Du Bois died in exile. Monroe Trotter, the famous Boston Brahmin, allegedly fell from the roof of his own house. And he had been walking on that roof for a generation. It was his family home. You tell me a man can't balance himself on the roof of a house where he played as a child, that he was going to fall from there, and he wasn't a heavy drinking man, so he surely wasn't up there drunk. So I think Monroe Trotter was mysteriously killed. Of course, we know about Martin Luther King. So long as he was preaching peace and love, he was comparatively safe. And when he began to talk about poor people's marches and the unification of the black poor and the white poor, he had projected himself into the cross currents of power and conflict and the invisible empire of high finance and power, and decided that he had to go. And you can see this pattern repeating itself over and over again. Now, the most tragic display of this pattern is in local black leadership that never gets into the newspaper. I mean, in small towns and blacks protesting, and sometimes they're killed by the hands of blacks, but it doesn't matter whose hands killed them, who ordered the killing is what is really important. It really doesn't matter whether the Jews killed Christ. The main thing is that Roman colonialism dominated the area, and if the Roman colonialists didn't want him killed, they could have stopped it by the wave of a hand. And so the Romans are more guilty if anybody is guilty at all. And see, I'm saying that it doesn't matter if black hands killed Malcolm X. They obviously did. But black hands, black minds didn't order the murder of a Malcolm X. But this takes us too far from our subject. What we're trying to deal with is the pattern of murder of black leadership by the establishment that has been more than consistent for well over 100 years and will remain so until there's enough political and physical power in the black community to tell that establishment that this man, my spokesman, will not be sacrificed.
What kind of leadership can we expect to see in the future?
We expect to see several types of leadership, but because most black organizations have fallen apart on the basis of poor administration, I think what we really need are less charismatic leaders and more astute administrators who can hold the pieces together and keep the money from being dissipated and keep the programs functioning and keep the promise to the people. I think the next kind of leader we need might be the type who is, well, ego-satisfied to the point of not needing the public bow and the hurrah, and who would keep things together and who can be relatively obscure. That's the kind we need, and I think it's the kind we're going to get in some cases. We're still going to get the share of daddy-o hustler leaders, but I think the people are more and more owned to them than ever because of the absolute con game they ran in the anti-poverty programs, and they're still running to some extent in model cities. I think blacks are beginning to make a reassessment of this fast-talking, very articulate con man. And I think he's going to see him coming in the future and going to recognize more sincerity in people. I think the games with black people over leadership may be over. And I think it's over because they have awakened to the point of saying it's over.
Where are blacks headed now politically?
I think black people are at the crossroads politically, educationally, socially, and everything else. I think we are regrouping and looking for whole new directions. I think we're at a period when the charismatic leader may be over. We might be thinking over what caliber of leader we need in this next move forward. I think we're looking nationally and internationally, and I think we are beginning to catch on to the kinds of games that are being played on us both nationally and internationally. I think we're looking toward Africa more than we have ever looked before, and realizing that there's a job of cooperation that we can do there. And I think we are losing our fascination for the so-called American dream, because we're realizing that the dream wasn't dreamed for us, and the promise wasn't made to us. I think that we will reconsider Pan-Africanism in a different kind of way, other than the phraseology and the ceremony. We will understand the possibility of black people in this country going to Africa and helping in hospitals and building roads and some kind of a corporation. And I think we're going to take this thing beyond Pan-Africanism into a concept of African World Union. I mean, I feel rather good about the possibilities before us. And I think that of the people whose teachings that we will turn to, Malcolm X will not be the only one, but he will surely be one that's going to be highly and respectfully considered.
Did Malcolm X have any influence on your own political ideology and development?
Well, I think that, like any black person, my age, I think that Malcolm X did, in fact, have an influence. But I think, honestly, I would have to admit that he probably has had more influence on me since his death than he did when he was alive. Because when he was alive, that was another, period, at least, that I was going through. And I really saw a lot of the views, now that I think about it in all honesty, a lot of the views that Malcolm was putting forth as being things that I really couldn't get down with. And that I was, at that point, more in tune with what King and some other people were talking about. And it was only after I saw Malcolm in a debate with Louis Lomax in Cleveland, Ohio, that I really began to understand what he was saying. And it was just shortly thereafter that he was murdered. So that I would say that definitely he's had an influence on me as a person and as a black man, and the kinds of things that he, had to say.
Mm-hmm. Where is your head now politically?
I have, much more concern now, or at least I think a greater understanding about the question of monopoly capitalism and imperialism and the part that that plays in the overall oppression of black people, which means that whereas 3 years ago I might have come at the thing from strictly a race question and not dealing with the question of capitalism, that as I've traveled, throughout Africa and had the opportunity to sit down with Sekou Touré and meet Amilcar Cabral and to spend a great deal of time last summer with Louis Cabral and to talk to the people in Frelimo, to talk to brothers and sisters from the New Jewel movement, for example, in Grenada, and that are now, involved in the struggle there, that my understanding, I think, of what the nature of the oppression of black people is in this country and throughout the world is a little bit different than what it was, say 3 years ago. And that, my concern now is one of trying to develop strong organizations in the black community that are, in fact, rooted in the black working class. Because I think that when you begin to look at it, the struggle against racism has to be also a struggle to eliminate capitalism, because it is, in fact, capitalism that provides the material base for the existence of racism. And if we're not, in fact, prepared to struggle against capitalism or, imperialism as its highest extension, then we're going to have a situation where, like, for example, you have a lot of neo-colonialist puppets. So even though the government is black, the reality of the lives of the masses of workers and peasants haven't changed. So that I see much more now the importance of struggle for fundamental change in the political economic system, as opposed to just simply changing the relationship between white people and black people.
What is the significance of African Liberation Day and the African Liberation Day Support Committee?
Well, I think that the significance of ALD, that the first time it occurred in '72, was that was really the first time, to my knowledge, for some time, I guess, probably since Garvey, that people had actually gotten out on the streets to say that they supported, what was happening in Africa and dealt with it in that fashion. But I think that the significance of the committee beyond that demonstration is that people have begun to see that it's not only a question of demonstrating once a year, but it is a question of trying to build a type of committee that can support the struggles of black people in this country, as well as give concrete assistance to liberation movements. Because in our discussions with liberation movements, the thing that they kept driving home to us was that the most important way that Afro-Americans can aid in the struggle of the liberation movements is to, in fact, increase the struggle of black people inside this country against racism and imperialism, and that we sit in the heart of monopoly capitalism in the world, and that if we can begin to struggle here, an effective revolutionary struggle here, that by definition, that struggle will aid their struggle. So I think that the support committee has been significant in helping a number of us grow, to see that reality. I think the fact that brothers and sisters have continued to work day to day, demonstrations against Gulf oil, demonstrations against banks, getting petitions signed to repeal the Byrd Amendment, getting petitions signed to demand that the United States recognize Guinea-Bissau. Plus, last year we raised $42,000 for liberation movements, had demonstrations in 28 cities. I think that all of that has led to a growth in the awareness of the role that Africa plays in the imperialist structure in the world, and then more importantly, what it is that we need to do, inside this country.
Do you think black people are moving toward an acceptance of Malcolm's ideology and ideas?
Well, see, I think that there are a couple of things about Malcolm that people have to deal with. Number one, I think you have to consider Malcolm, in his historical context. Number two, I think you can't talk about Malcolm without also talking about, Elijah Muhammad in terms of the effect that, that the teacher had on the student, type of situation. So that in terms of a general acceptance of Malcolm's ideas, I would say that there are more people who generally accept his ideas. The problem is, though, that people will tend to accept his ideas and not apply them to the particular historical circumstance that they live in. Because, see, I think that if you read over Malcolm's speeches and Malcolm's statements, that I would not be so sure that Malcolm would put forth the same particular ideas today that he did then, and that I think people do Malcolm a disservice not to try and apply or reconsider the points that Malcolm made within the context of the historical period that we live in, which is something I think that we have to struggle more to do.
Did Malcolm X have any influence on your political ideology and activity?
Yes, he had quite a bit. In fact, the Black Panther Party, Malcolm X is sort of the father of it. The fact that Malcolm X has been murdered probably drove Huey and I to a point to say that we was going to have to create an organization reflective of what he was talking about. The fact that Malcolm said that by legal constitutional right, the Second Amendment, that every black man and woman, black person in this country had a right to have a shotgun in their home to defend themselves from unjust attacks by racism, which is one point that influenced us very much. But what influenced us even more was Malcolm's emphasis that we must have a political organization that dealt most immediately with the housing and the clothing and shoes and food for the people. That while we deal with this, ultimately, the revolutionary process will go on, and it will probably still be somewhat of a violent revolution. As you know, even in this period, although there's numerous violence still being committed against black people, there's a lot of organizing to do. There's a broad liberation framework to be built. And this is one of the most, and this still goes on, this influence that Malcolm gave, especially in the area of the political arena, talking about a political party. And that's why, that's essentially the basis by which we organize what we call a political party that would take a concrete stand, not only as men, as human beings, as strong women who are in the organizations, what have you, but also with concrete programs that really serve the basic interests, desires, and needs of the people, as also a means to help organize them more.
Do you think black people are moving toward an acceptance of Malcolm X's ideology and ideas?
Oh, definitely. I do. From over the last 7 years, I think we can see a lot of this, I think Malcolm's ideas were profound, in what he understood and what he tried to contribute, to the liberation of black people. you know, the character of the movements, and the movement is kind of especially the Black liberation struggle, from the time of when Malcolm and Martin Luther King first came on the set in the 50s, you know, varied in characters, demonstrations, etc., and then in August of 1965, the Black Rebellion started in Watts. And from there, we started looking around, and we said, well, what was the next character? The character took on somewhat the battles, you know, organizationally. It wasn't only our organization who got caught in battles with the police who were attacking, you know. That took some part of the character while the anti-war movement was floating in between, etc., okay? The Black Students Union merged in, you know, right around slightly before the Black Panther Party started, which Huey and I happened to be a part of, which became characteristics of campuses. So you start looking at all these different variable aspects of the movement and trying to pinpoint their character developments, different types of characters of the movement, the liberation struggle develops. Now, a lot of people say, what's happened to the movement? What's happened to the movement? What's happened to the Black liberation struggle? What we have to do is learn how to pinpoint it. Some 79 candidates, Black candidates, ran for political offices throughout the South in the last year or so, year and a half. Nearly 50 of them won those offices. Now, that's a significant change, may we say, okay? But that's characteristic of Black liberation, the desire for Black liberation. Now, some of those candidates, I believe there's a good handful of them, just corrupt. But what I value in that is the masses of the Black people are voting block vote and voting in opposition to the racists. That's consciousness. I say yes, that they did accept a lot of Malcolm's ideas. Malcolm may not have, Malcolm said the ballot or the bullet. Did he not? You can see where we are, you know. His ideas, acceptable. Look at the people that used the ballot. Many of us, many of the mass of people respected the way we stood up and defended ourselves with a bullet at one stage of the struggle. Now it has a different character.
What kind of changes has the party gone through since 1968?
Now, those programs did directly aid in the ability of a political vehicle such as the party to be able to run an election in Oakland as we did. I would like to answer the questions where people think or misunderstand that why did Bobby Seale run for political office, run for mayor? And Malcolm X said, by any means necessary, you know? And Malcolm X did point out to us, you know, not only do we defend ourselves, you know, like human beings, like men and women, but that defense he was talking about, that Huey P. has projected, and as Malcolm has stated himself, having met him, not having met him myself personally, but having seen him speak, was that the violence is not only manifested only in the Billy Club. It's violent when you have hungry children. It's violent with rats, roaches, etc., which many Black organizations and groups of people understand and have picked up and begin to see. We have to defend ourselves against that, but it takes organization to do that, many organizing people in opposition to the power structure. So any time, and one of the means necessary to help build that broad liberation framework becomes dealing with political office, but the point is, do we have Malcolm X's in the country? I mean, Malcolm X's are people, brothers and sisters, you know, Harriet Tubmans and others, who have internalized heart, mind, and soul the philosophy of people's struggle, especially as it may be related to the Black community. Now, that is essential to how we've developed, and we've internalized that even more so in terms of the changes that we went through many years via the political oppression, the jailings, the many brothers and sisters have been killed, the more Black people that get killed in the community, whether they're Black Panther Party members or not, pushes us forward, you know. I'm sure it did the same thing to Malcolm and many other brothers and sisters, Martin Luther King and many others.
What kind of program can you project for the party over the next couple of years?
We're going to try to influence and get people to take time to realize the necessity of registering to vote and voting in blocks in opposition to racist candidates, and also a few handful of Black candidates who are not sincere, who are only puppets for the power structure. And when we do get some good candidates in offices, that the people don't just assume that a Black candidate is going to be able to do everything. That community has to be behind him, because there's some candidates who are sincere but never had the real organizational backup from the community, you know, where they could really, you know, move the tax monies and the funds back into the direction or in the framework of what we call liberation. we're going to be involved in that as much as possible. And the more and more we get involved in that, trying to step by step add something to this framework, this liberation framework that I keep speaking of, we will also try to see to it that, or help get people to see, and they can get us to even see more, even better ways as we work together, how to transform, as I mentioned earlier, certain institutionalized functions, such as the offices of the vice president and the president. I mean, from the time that that thing was set up, that system was set up in this country, it was set up so that no one could become a king. But look at Richard Nixon with his executive privilege, as, was it George III, King George III, with his special vetoes. It's the same thing. You know, his special veto saying later, and he's disguising with executive privilege. I mean, this is what's happening. I mean, impounding funds, etc., you know. I mean, a whole gross cross-the-board cutback of services in this country for the people on the domestic level, and black people suffer the blunt end of that, of everything that Nixon does. Even though you might hear the truck drivers with their special strikes and other people suffering, black people really get the blunt end of it. So black people should be definitely involved in moving to try to help get people to organize and unify around getting that Congress, who has the legal, constitutional legality, to alter, you know, that executive office of president and vice president, those two offices, and in turn replace with administrative experts, because all those agencies in the executive department are created by law by the Congress in the first place, you see. And then many of those executive administrative experts will have to be appointed to certain agencies to run them, and then those laws can be better enforced, you know, without having some nut like Nixon talking about impounding this and cutting back this, etc., you know, and waging unjust wars against our brothers and people around the world who are oppressed. So we're going to be involved in a lot on one level or another. At the same time, when I say we're going to get rid of the whole thing about vice president and president, we also want to encourage more people to vote for the congressman, you know, for your local level legislative bodies and agencies, because there's too many county governments and city governments and state legislative seats, you know, that black people could have real good representatives in.